Today, as we near the end of the season of peace and nonviolence, we remember 5 peacemakers and celebrate their contributions.
Martin Luther King, a leader of the American Civil Rights Movement.
Nelson Mandela, who brought an end to apartheid in South Africa.
Cesar Chavez, who promoted the rights of farm workers in California.
And the Dalai Lama, who still seeks a peaceful resolution in Tibet.
These leaders, and many others, proudly acknowledge their debt to the Mahatma, Mohandas K. Gandhi, who promoted to the end of his life the operating principle of his life, ahimsa, the power and the courage of love. To follow the doctrine of ahimsa means you may not offend anyone, you may not harbor an uncharitable thought even of your enemy. Indeed, the man who follows ahimsa has no enemies. Gandhi said, "One cannot practice ahimsa and be without courage. The practice of ahimsa calls forth the greatest strength." Gandhi died at the hand of an assassin in 1948, the year after India gained its independence from Britain. His ability to stand in his truth, his satyagraha, one small man against an empire, was largely responsible. His strength shows that nonviolence can create change if you have the courage.
One leader to heed that call was Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. In the 1940s, King was a seminary student. He looked at the world around him and knew there was a growing need for social reform, but he doubted that love alone could do the work. Then he began reading Gandhi's writing on nonviolence, and his thinking changed. He learned how Gandhi had used ahimsa to confront the force of Great Britain, its army, and its politicians. King thought, why couldn't this same policy work for us in the United States? King was able to test his newfound philosophy in 1955 when at the age of 26 he led the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, where public buses had always been segregated. As the nonviolent protests continued, bus ridership dropped by 90%. King's home was bombed and he suffered many of the same abuses Gandhi had. But he stood in his truth and rallied the protesters with Gandhi's own words, cautioning them against any sort of violence. Finally, after 11 months and a case before the Supreme Court, segregation on buses was declared unconstitutional. During a pilgrimage to India, King spoke of the difference between passive resistance and non-resistance. He said, true nonviolent resistance is not unrealistic submission to evil power. It is rather a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. In 1964, King was given the Nobel Peace Prize. He has been called the American Gandhi.
The same year King went to India, 1959, the Tibetan uprising was brutally suppressed by the Chinese, and Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, fled to India. The Dalai Lama had been to India 3 years earlier to celebrate the Buddha's 2500th birthday. Like Martin Luther King Jr., he had sought out Gandhians to learn how India had achieved independence through nonviolence. Concerned about the survival of Tibetans and the country's unique heritage, the Dalai Lama has not called for the outright independence of Tibet or its separation from China. His middle way approach seeks autonomy, eliminating direct rule from Beijing, and giving Tibet the right to maintain its culture and religion while remaining part of China. The Dalai Lama's middle way approach and lifelong dedication to nonviolence were recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. In his speech to the Nobel Committee, the Dalai Lama said, "I accept the prize as a tribute to the man who founded the modern tradition of nonviolent action for change, Mahatma Gandhi, whose life taught and inspired me." The Dalai Lama acknowledges Gandhi as his mentor, but calls fellow Nobel laureate Nelson Mandela of South Africa, the Mahatma's successor, as a savior of humanity through his struggle for peaceful change.
Nelson Mandela, a young and successful lawyer, became active in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1940s. Mandela warned demonstrators of the difficulties they would face and urged them to refrain from violence. When Mandela and another lawyer opened their own practice in 1952, the first black legal firm in the country, they were inundated with African clients, many of them victims of the apartheid system. Mandela used the courts to good advantage, challenging white authority and building his reputation in the fight against discrimination. As South African authorities used more and more violence to crack down on the anti-apartheid movement, Mandela shifted his approach from civil disobedience to sabotage. "I followed the Gandhian strategy for as long as I could," he later wrote. "But then there came a point in our struggle when we could no longer counter brutality through passive resistance alone. Even then, we chose sabotage because it did not involve the loss of life and offered the best hope for future race relations." Mandela was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to life imprisonment for sabotage, making him an international symbol of struggle against apartheid. After 27 years, he was released from prison in 1990, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, and became the first president of post-apartheid South Africa in 1994.
Another of our Gandhians is Cesar Chavez. At the age of 21, he watched the newsreels announcing that Gandhi had defeated the British Empire without the use of force. He wondered how Gandhi could have accomplished such a feat. Born to a family of migrant workers, Chavez saw firsthand how Mexican Americans were treated with prejudice. He read Gandhi's autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, and then read everything he could find about Gandhi. Looking around at the exploitation of farm laborers in the United States, he incorporated Gandhi's commitment to ahimsa in his life's mission. During a strike against grape growers in California, he said, "If someone commits violence against us, it is much better not to react against it. People don't like to see a nonviolent movement subjected to violence." That's the key point we have going for us. We can change the world if we can do it nonviolently. Taking a cue from Gandhi, Chavez went on fasts, going without food for 25 days to bring attention to the cause. Cesar Chavez's passion brought religious and political leaders from around the country to California to march in support of the farm workers. After 5 years of protests, some grape growers signed agreements with the union, and the union lifted the grape boycotts. By the early 1980s, the tens of thousands of farm workers working under United Farm Workers contracts enjoyed higher pay, family health coverage, pension benefits, and other contract protections. Chavez died in his sleep in April 1993. Having never earned more than $6,000 a year or owned a house, Chavez nonetheless left a lasting legacy in his commitment to nonviolence and human rights.
Gandhi's example transcended color and politics. Dedicated to human rights and not willing to debase themselves through violence, leaders like King, the Dalai Lama, Mandela, and Cesar Chavez saw that ahimsa is more powerful than armed protests.
As Gandhi himself said, we may not use compulsion even in the matter of doing a good thing. Any compulsion will ruin the cause.
And as Cesar Chavez put it, once people understand the strength of nonviolence, the force it generates, the love it creates, the response it brings from the total community, they will not easily abandon it.
So, the these leaders of change, and today, like we've mentioned, is Palm Sunday. And so today we also honor Jesus the Christ, who, according to the biblical story, made his way into Jerusalem this week, the week that ended with his crucifixion. And so all of these leaders that you just heard about, including Jesus, are change agents. And they brought people together for a common purpose. And I believe that purpose was to co-create a world that works for all, where all experience dignity and worth and value, where love is expressed, compassion is expressed through connection. And these leaders, to me, all exhibited one crucial thing that made their ministry sacred. It was presence. They showed up. They showed up no matter what. And, there were no manuals that said how to end apartheid or seek justice, gain civil rights, or heal the sick or raise the dead. These leaders modeled what's possible when you show up and you stand in the wilderness. And for those of you that have been here over the last 5 weeks or so, we've also been reading Brene Brown's book, Braving the Wilderness, where she talks about the wilderness is a place where we take a stand, and in that stand, we embrace a level of self-belonging. Because sometimes when we're standing in the wilderness, I'll assert most times when we stand in the wilderness, like these leaders we've just heard about, and Jesus, they stand alone. And so what it takes from them is great courage and great trust in the wisdom and the passion and the vision that's on their heart. Jesus knew when he walked into Jerusalem that Sunday that there was a price on his head. Instead of avoiding, he showed up. He connected. He did what was his to do from the wisdom of his soul, and he did it without killing or hurting, even though his life was threatened. He stood in the wilderness. He showed up, he took the hands of his disciples, and he stood his ground. And his presence and consciousness was the transformation. He modeled how to stand in the wilderness and feel connection with himself and with those around him. He modeled showing up in compassion and love and forgiveness. He modeled the sacred ministry of presence, regardless of what was happening around him. And to me, that speaks to every one of those amazing leaders that you just heard about. There's something really beautiful about the ministry of presence. I've taught that because it was taught to me in my pastoral care classes in ministerial school. And so I have translated that information over to the prayer chaplains that you have here. These beautiful souls that wear these little purple stoles that pray us in, at 10:40 every Sunday, and that sit across from you after the service and hold space and listen to your prayers. And they, in turn, as they listen and they hear you, they hold presence. And what we've talked about in our time together as prayer chaplains is that, there's really no right words to say. Have you ever noticed that when you've been sad or maybe you've had an experience of pain in your life and a good friend has come to you, has it really been about what they've said, or has it been about their presence? When they reached out and they took your hand, or put their arm around you and just let you know that their love, their compassion, their heart was with you. And so today, in Brené's chapter of Hold Hands with Strangers, I was at the march yesterday. Who was at the march yesterday? Yeah. And whether you were at the march yesterday, whether that's a cause that's really on your heart, one of the things that was so beautiful to me yesterday was the ministry of presence I saw expressing. People showed up to support those amazing, beautiful, powerful, courageous students on that stage. And there was something about, they said there were 800,000 people there, and there were about 5 of us together from Unity of Gaithersburg. And I just felt the kindred connection of everyone there. And there's something so beautiful about that, the connection. Everyone was kind to each other. Everyone honored the space of the other person standing next to them, whether they were shoulder to shoulder, holding signs on the metro, in Union Station, wherever it was. There was just this beautiful synergy of connection. And folks, because this is on my heart, I really got at a deep level the sacredness of our collective assembly when we come together in sacred community. And that's why it just jazzes the heck out of me to come here on Sunday mornings. Because there is something so sacred and so beautiful about coming to one room, one space, one campus. There's a lot of other places you could be this morning. And coming together in sacred community. So I'm going to ask you to do something, and this is a little vulnerable. They're like, oh, geez. But what I'm going to ask you to do is wherever you are, I'm going to ask you to reach out, and I'm going to ask you to touch someone. Either you don't have to hold their hand if that doesn't feel comfortable. Just reach out. If you're sitting by yourself, just put your hand maybe on someone's shoulder. And you guys connect. I'm going to come around and I'm going to find out it's okay. Someone. Okay. And so let's just take a moment and just notice your experience. Notice if this feels awkward to you. Notice if you're like, oh my gosh, I can't wait till this is over. Just notice your experience. But what I'd like for you to do right now, and notice if you just want to giggle or laugh because you're just like, oh, I feel nervous. Or if you just want to sit in the lap of someone, that's unity. If you're here with us for the first time, I hope you don't run screaming from the building. But what I would really like for you to just breathe into right now, the person that's touching you has felt sorrow. The person that you're connecting with has experienced loss. The person that you're connecting with has experienced joy. The person you're connecting with has felt love. Folks, it's so beautiful. Every single person, I don't care what they're saying on Facebook or what sign they're carrying or how they feel about a certain issue, everyone has shared humanity. We belong to each other. And so can you take a moment to just breathe into the connection that you're sharing with the human being next to you? You are expressing a sacred ministry of presence right now. You can let go now if you'd like to. And just notice your experience. Just notice. So, we aren't strangers. And you know, it doesn't have to be that you go running up to someone on the street and grab their hand. They might run from you. But how the sacred ministry of presence can show up is a handshake, a smile, holding the door open for someone. Yesterday when I was going down the metro, I said, I'm going to put this in practice. And sometimes when I'm riding on the metro for that long, my tummy doesn't really like it too well. And so I decided, what can I do? So I started talking with a couple. I didn't even notice when it was Union Station. It was so wonderful to just connect with them. And on the way home, this beautiful junior in high school named Solomon from Liberia asked me through an extended hand, "Hi, can I sit with you?" I'm like, "You sit right here." And we talked nonstop for 45 minutes. And I got to hear this young man lives in South Bend, Indiana. He really wonders why he does that. He used to live in Liberia and misses it so much. But his family's in South Bend, Indiana, and he came to the march because it was a passion on his heart. And he shared with me for 45 minutes his passion for life. He wants to be a doctor and why this march means so much to his heart. I left that train ride inspired and empowered by the light of this precious soul. Folks, we belong to each other. And more than any time I can ever remember, we are being called to remember this and claim the sacred ministry of presence. Let's show up wherever we are. And I know it takes courage, and I know sometimes it's vulnerable, but I know we can do it because we are pure love. Are you with me? So this week, let's do it. Let's just create opportunities for ourselves to connect, to talk to a stranger, to reach out, remembering that we all share humanity, that we all belong to each other. All right, let's affirm together. I reach out and courageously extend my heart to interact with others. Together, we deepen our connection, shared humanity, and belonging. And so it is. Blessings.